It's time to turn our attention to the ear, which is a fairly complex shape that's comprised of several individual pieces. And once we are familiar with those individual pieces, even though it's a complex shape, it's really not that hard to form. And so first thing I want to do is jump over to our anatomic model to analyze the anatomy. I need to turn on my skin labels. And first we'll talk about the 5 main features. So number 1 is the helix, which is kind of a number 9 shape that starts at the left center of the ear and it swings around very much into a number 9 shape. Next, we'll look at the antihelix, which is pretty easy to remember in terms of the name, like an opposing version of the helix, and it's shaped like a Y that hooks down. So let's say a lowercase y, depending on the font you're thinking of in your head. So 2 branches at the upper left, swinging down into the antitragus, which sits at the bottom of the Y shape. And in opposition to that is the tragus. And finally, at the bottom, the antitragus and the helix converge into the lobule or the earlobe. All right, so those are the 5 most important features. If you remember those, you should be able to get most of the way through your ear shape. But there are 4 more terms you can commit to memory for extra credit, so to speak, that mostly have to do with the negative space between the 5 most important shapes. So at the fork in the antihelix Y shape, we have the triangular fossa. This is a depression shaped like a triangle. In the negative space between the helix and antihelix on the right side is the scapha. And inside the hook of the Y, we have the concha, which I've also heard pronounced concha. And then the only one not labeled is the actual hole that goes into the ear. And this is the auditory canal. All total, that's 9 terms to remember, so it's kind of a lot. But again, the most important is the first 5. So let's apply that to our sculpture. First thing I want to do is hit I to enable the inflate brush, and I'm going to carve out a dip in the center of our ear. So hold Control and start carving that out. There we go, it looks pretty good. Fairly subtle, but now the overall shape will conform to this dip rather than being flat. That's one thing I see happen a lot for new sculptors, is they will sculpt the shapes of the ear on a flat surface instead of a concave one. And that always looks wrong. Now, before I spend too much time on the front, I actually want to address the back. Now, if I undo, you'll see that the back of the ear is affected. And that's because our inflate brush, and all our brushes as far as I know, do not have front faces only. So they will affect the back surface and the front, which in the ear is a perfect example of where that's a problem. Because we're going to be spending a lot of time on the front of the ear and I don't want it to mess up the back. So we need to be mindful to always enable brush front faces only. So the inflate brush I'll be using a lot. That's where it's important. Also, next I'm going to use the fill brush. And so I'll make sure to enable front faces only there. And I'm going to go ahead and address the back so that I don't forget about it. So with the fill brush, we've got this really thin disc that's going to become our helix, but we need to bulk the meat behind the ear. And so I'm going to use the fill brush, make several strokes, because I don't want the back side of the helix to be that extensive by itself. All right, so bulking up the back, that looks pretty good. Concentrating in the center, I do want to leave a little bit of a dip at the bottom side where it connects to the earlobe, but I think that looks pretty good. Leaving enough of the helix, but not too much. And then what I've got left over from the sternocleidomastoid connection to the skull is a dip, and I want to maintain that. So let's use Shift-C, my crease brush, hold Control. And remember, with the crease brush, holding Control only works because I changed the default behavior to plus. So I've created a bit of a dip, and then out of that dip, I'm going to hold Control and cut a strong crease all the way around, forming the earlobe a little more substantially, or at least the connection from an earlobe to the side of the face. And then I'll switch over to the Draw Sharp now that I have geometry updated from the crease brush. All right, so we've drawn the crease connection, but I need to sort of chunk out what's left below it. So I'm going to use my clay strips brush, hold Control, kind of chunk out some of that geometry. Now, I'm feeling like My sculpture is going a little bit slow and sluggish at times. So let's switch to object mode. And anytime I want to optimize a mesh using dynamic topology as my workflow, I can switch to my modifiers and add a decimate modifier. All right, we're looking at 330,000 faces, which isn't that many, but still I'm experiencing a little bit of sluggishness. So let's type in a ratio of like 0.2, and that should get us down to about 70,000, which should be plenty of geometry to maintain the shapes we've created up to this point. Let's just do a double check. My eyes look good, nose looks good, mouth looks good. So yeah, 66 to 70,000, that's going to be fine. And then we will apply that. Now this should be much more optimized when we jump back over to sculpt mode. And that decimate modifier optimization is something I do usually a handful of times during sculpting. All right, so we've addressed the back of the ear. We probably will come back to touch it up a bit. The only thing I haven't really addressed is how the top side of the connection is shaped. So we'll use that crease brush because it does come to a pretty sharp point. Like that, and then smooths out fairly quickly once we kind of get out from behind the back of the ear. All right, so that looks pretty good. Maybe pull it down a little bit. All right, I think that's good for the back of the ear. And now we can focus on the front, which first shape I will address is going to be the helix. I like to switch to the inflate brush, and we'll begin sculpting a number 9 type shape. So we're starting about in the center of the ear, maybe a little bit higher than the center, and we will just start sculpting this number 9. Trying to stay close to the edge, maybe increase my strength a little bit. I don't want to connect it, I want to leave a space. There we go. There is the beginning of the helix. But it's still a very subtle version of the helix. Where we're going to get the majority of the definition is by subtracting some digital clay now. So on the inside of that number 9, we're going to hold Control and really chunk out a significant amount on that inside edge. So I'm going to turn the strength all the way up to 1 and disable my pen tablet sensitivity so that I get full strength with every stroke. All right, and I'm going to start chunking out the inside of our helix stroke. And now this is a little bit tedious, but we want to chunk out a lot. Let's see, that artifact is probably due to me using subdivide edges, which I don't want to use initially. Let's start with subdivide collapse. Hold shift to smooth that out. There we go. And then we're going to stop at the base of the number 9 before we get to the earlobe. And then we're going to repeat that process until we have a substantial canal running along the inside. Okay, now you might think that that's enough because we do get a pretty harsh shadow on the inside ridge of the helix. However, that's not enough. If I switch to wireframe and we look at the silhouette, right now our canal is shaped like this. So it's kind of a 90-degree indentation. We actually want it to be more like this. Increasing the depth of that canal is going to be important for when we add a skin shader and want the translucence to be very realistic, because this part of the ear is much thinner than what I have currently. All right, so let's go back to our inflate brush and continue that process. And you'll notice that I'm not inflating directly at the front of the ear. I'm actually at an angle trying to inflate back and tuck it under the ridge of the helix. All right, let's take a look at the silhouette now. There we go. That's much better. Much more appropriate in terms of ear thickness or helix thickness. And when we add a shader, it's going to be translucent with that orangey subsurface scatter and be much more believable. So this process always leaves you with some bumps. For example, right here on the inside, once we start to address the anti-helix, that's going to be a problem. But also, if we look around the ridge of the helix, this is a good time to smooth out both the ridges and also inconsistencies in the thickness of the helix. Like right here, it gets really thin. So we will use our inflate brush. Let's turn on pressure sensitivity again and kind of bulk that back out. Bulk and smooth, inflate and smooth. There we go, that looks better. So that is one part down, the helix. Now, that channel that we cut left us with the beginnings of the anti-helix Y shape. So we can begin sculpting that next. We'll switch back to our inflate brush, which I already have enabled, and we can begin making that Y. All right, so I'm gonna do it just like I write it. Start with that branch and then hook all the way around. There we go, nice lowercase y, extending the branch a little further down than I would normally make my letters. Hold Control to make sure we have the triangular fossa in there and smooth it as well. Now with the inflate brush, one of the problems with the brush, or side effects that you just have to be aware of, is the lumpiness. And so even though the ear is fairly lumpy, or at least you can get away with some lumps, you don't want it to be too lumpy. So you'll commonly see me smoothing out a lot during this process, and you might even experience the fighting of the lumps. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, the Y split in the anti-helix does get really close to touching the ridge of the helix. So with my fill brush, I'm going to fill in that space to kind of connect to the branch. Both branches on both sides. Okay, that should leave us with a nice tight crease between helix and branches of the anti-helix. Control I to engage the, or just I to engage the inflate brush, hold Control to inflate it down. And I'm gonna push the canal deeper on either side of the branch as well as in the middle. All right, on the right side, that's going to help with the scapha. And then below, that's going to take us into the concha. And then we can, of course, inflate where we filled to make that even tighter. But I probably want to wait to do that when we engage the subdivide edges type of dynamic topology. But okay, that looks pretty good. We've got the Y shape of the anti-helix. Yeah, that's a good beginning to the shape, which segues into the anti-tragus down here at the base of our anti-helix. All right, so this is kind of like a corner that I'm just going to inflate and then cut down. Okay, that's going to serve as the beginning of the anti-tragus. And then on the opposite side, we'll do a similar corner, maybe a little bit bigger and opposite shaped. Smooth out the left side into the cheek. And then we can adjust for the auditory canal. So in between left side of the helix and tragus, I'm just going to inflate, once again, turning off pressure sensitivity. And in between those two, I'm just going to hold Control and create a big hole. Make several strokes at full strength, switch to wireframe, and you can see that start to enter inwardly towards the inside of the head. I also like to pull that forward. There we go. All right, so we've got the auditory canal. We just need to adjust the tragus and helix accordingly. With the tragus first and the inflate brush, I'm going to push that corner out once again. I need to turn off or turn on pressure sensitivity. That was getting a little out of hand. Maybe use the fill brush as it connects to the cheek. That's pretty smooth in general. Whereas on the right side, as it dips into the auditory canal, it's a very harsh shadow, a very harsh indentation there. And in fact, we need to connect, let's do the inflate brush again. We're gonna connect the tragi and then push inward on the inside ridges. All right, this is a very tight canal, so let's use my draw sharp brush. And we'll cut that in first on the inside, kind of feather it out as we get into the concha. But once we've cut it sharp, then we can use our inflate brush and inflate it inwardly. All right, that harsh shadow, similar to the interior ridge of the helix, is important down here at the bottom. Okay, so once I've got that started, maybe I'll just pull the antitragus up, the ridge up and over. And then from the front angle of the head, the tragus does sit out there like that, but maybe not quite that much. And some of it does come to a triangular point. When I say some of it, some people have a nice point onto the tragus. There we go, that looks pretty good. And there, of course, with all the facial features, there's a wide spectrum of exactly how this looks on people. Even though I don't really think people are recognized by their ears. You know, if you showed me a picture of Tom Cruise's ears, I wouldn't say definitely Tom Cruise, but just his eyes, just his nose, just his mouth, I would have a decent chance of guessing that's who it is. So I interpret that to be a lot of freedom in how ears are shaped, as long as it's based on this foundation that we're going over now. And that is looking pretty good in terms of the majority of the anatomy. Let's just smooth out this shape as it swings around the concha and into the auditory canal. So I'm just kind of, well, I'm increasing the depth of the concha. That looks good. We've got some leftover broad geometry at the top. Let's smooth that out. And this means we are very close to being done with the key structures, at least. And once we have the key structures, we can finalize some of their proportions and angles. There's a couple key angles that I find crucial for a believable ear. But those were really only the 5 pieces, you know, that we sculpted intentionally. The helix, antihelix, tragus, antitragus, and now the earlobe, which the earlobe sort of sculpts itself in my experience. You know, converging all these shapes together, and we have a pretty believable earlobe. But now that we're about 80% there, maybe even 90%, there's one key angle shift that I want to show you, and it's between the helix and antihelix. So first, some ears are shaped pretty straight along the helix, but I find more often the helix kind of has a curvature backward toward the head. So I'm going to institute that now. All right, so not a straight line, more of a curve backward. And then I need to be mindful at the top. All right, so we want that to be a nice, smooth, sweeping curve where it protrudes out and then curves backward towards the head and then down. Okay, but this kind of S curve is important. Once we've got that involved, I'm going to mask out the antihelix. So we'll switch to the mask brush, simply paint that Y shape, and then hit A to bring up our mask pie menu and choose smooth mask. Maybe do that a couple times. 3 times even. Then Control I to invert the mask. All right, we're going to change the angle of this shape. And I'll just turn off overlays so I don't have to look at the mask. All right, currently it follows the helix very closely, but we want it to be juxtaposed to the angle of the helix. So I'm going to pull inward the top and then pull outward significantly the bottom. All right, so looking from the front angle, this crisscross of angles between the helix and antihelix is very important. Without it, the ear feels very flat. And so now that the angles are there, I can kind of work with the shapes a little bit better. Let's Alt-M to clear the mask. We can enable subdivide edges because now we're committing to these shapes. We don't want to generate new topology if we don't have to. And so the bottom of the antihelix, I think, is a little bit too sharp. I want to plump that up a bit. All right, so we plump it up, we smooth it out. Remember that the inflate brush can run into problems when using subdivide edges, but if we use it sparingly and not drastically, it should turn out okay. And then, so the concha is pretty deep, which currently I like this depth. Also on the left side of the Y branch of the anti-helix gets pretty deep as well. So I'm going to really push that in here. Okay, it's got a nice sharp crease between the helix ridge and the branch of the anti-helix. Triangular fossa gets pretty deep as well. So I'm going to just increase that a little bit. Or especially as it approaches the ridge of the helix is where it gets deep. I feel like the ridge needs to come out as well. It's a little bit too thin. And then the scapha also gets pretty deep as it approaches the ridge of the helix. All right, make sure to smooth that out. And that looks pretty good. Yeah, I like the angles, how they exist now. Typically, this branch of the helix doesn't bump out quite so much, so let's pull that back. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with the ear shape, at least in terms of it being a generic ear. Maybe I will, let's see, use my crease brush, Shift-C, kind of tighten this connection into the earlobe. And then sometimes I do like to make a subtle crease in between helix and earlobe. Always keep it subtle, so maybe cut it deeper and then smooth it out. But you'll see that kind of not be one continuous contour between lobe to helix. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. So that's a decent generic ear. Last thing to check, let's go to our 3 orthographic. How does the scale look? You know, people have all ranges of sizes in their ears. The older they are, the larger the ears get. But for this person, I feel like the ears may be a little bit too large and chunky, especially on the bottom side, actually. So let me use the grab brush to kind of pull the chunk a little bit thinner. Also, the bottom of the ear I think is too low. It needs to be brought up to about the base of the nose. So I'm going to make my grab brush really large, pull it all up. And there's usually an angle to the ear where the lobe is further forward towards the front of the face. But at this point, you know, we have a generic ear complete. We would just want to tweak it to our taste, basically. Anatomically, we're in a good spot. And we can call that ear complete.